Thank you very much for the invitation to present here, and thanks to the previous presenters. They had really interesting case studies and best practices, I would say, that may inspire us to measure anyhow. Since I believe that the action frameworks are also quite important, due also connected with measurement frameworks. We are now in this last part talking about the measurement frameworks, but in the end, all our measurement frameworks must be connected with the action frameworks that have been seen to these case studies in the end. I'm going to talk today about the PSR waste management framework and monitoring approach in Croatia, in our observatory, and also an example of one of our islands, Krk Island, one of the biggest islands in the Adriatic Sea. Further on, I'm not going to talk about our observatory. You probably know we have been established in 2016, and we are working as a part of the Institute for Tourism, which is a research institution in Croatia. Shortly, we have in the study established 15 indicators we are going to measure. Of course, due to UNWTO mandatory issues and ETIS actions, we have picked out of those that are comparable for us and that are, let's say, reasonable to measure. When considering the waste, we have picked out the waste production per tourist night compared to general population waste production per resident night to measure. In environmental impacts, you can see we have picked out 5 of the indicators, while one of them is impacting on waste production, and we are trying to follow it on the regional level, on not INSTO level, but also on the county level. Shortly, when talking about the waste production per tourist in relation to resident waste production on the Adriatic Croatia level and also on the county level, we must say that it's based on total amount of solid waste produced and based on number of residents and number of tourist overnights in the same year. You can see here data for 2019. And it's quite important to stress out that during that we have put it 2019 since it's the last normal touristic year where we had greater impacts. And the rate of tourist waste production increased in the comparison to 2016 for 16%. So in this short period of 3 years, we have 16% more waste from the tourism, which is a number that must worry us if the tourism as it was comes back again. Therefore, we must think then about management actions, and of course, talking about the introduction, of course, not about the landfills, but also about the reduction of the whole waste production in the end. Of course, this indicator has some limitation. It includes only commercial accommodation, and we must say that the patterns of consumption are under the assumption that the tourists and residents have the same patterns of the consumption, which is not necessarily correct. But since in Adriatic Croatia, we have a lot of tourists that are staying in private accommodation, most of their actions are very similar to the residents. So we could establish that assumption. Further on, even though you see these numbers, okay, therefore they don't seem perhaps that terrifying for the counties, but those are numbers that are not giving a very clear situation. When compared to the numbers for the destination for certain cities in those counties, we can see a big difference. For example, here we have one county which has a town of Novalja, which has much greater impact of the waste production from tourism than the whole county. So we must say that it's quite important for the observatories to try to establish measurement of such indicators on the destination level as soon as possible. For example, Dubrovnik, which is a UNESCO site, has quite bigger numbers than the Dubrovnik-Neretva county in terms of the waste production from the tourists. So we must definitely focus on the local level when monitoring this kind of indicators. Further on, we have been talking about the DPCR framework, which is actually accompanied by the selected indicators which have evaluated which is a widely used tool, and it is communicating in the end knowledge of the connection between the environment, the economy, and the society, of course. And some of the basic questions when we implement the framework are who is the one who produces the waste, which is quite important when monitoring waste in tourism. Who manages waste? It has been stressed out earlier that it's better to have private companies than municipalities or government companies. What quantities of waste are generated? In what way in tourism, especially seasonality, is it the driver? What are successful responses in waste management? So that is, I would say, one kind of a scheme we must all follow when talking about the management of the waste and monitoring. These are all the questions that we have to answer through the DPCR framework. Here is a from the European Environmental Agency, their framework for the waste management. What are the drivers, pressures, state impacts, and of course the responses in the end, which also have the impact on the other elements of the framework. When talking about the drivers, one of the most important is definitely tourism seasonality. And it is very important, especially for the Mediterranean countries. And through it, pressures such as waste generation, also the land use for waste management facilities, states that are then becoming a reality through the decrease of the air quality, abating water quality, and so on. And in the end, we can see the real impacts through the threat for the human health and well-being, land use, loss of habitats. And therefore, in the end, through all this, through this framework and measurement, we must build out the appropriate responses through the regulations, economic instruments, and of course, the waste management practices. Just some additional waste indicators for Adriatic Croatian counties, so you get a bit more clear picture what we are talking about. So during the last 6 years before the pandemic, we had the total quantities of municipality waste increased from 5.4 to 9.3, which is really worrying, but it's the numbers for the whole Croatia. So perhaps it's not so much. We only have, let's say, 10% of the waste generated in tourism. But if we look at the map of the whole Croatia, you can see here the generated municipality waste in the specific quantities of generated municipality waste per kilo per inhabited. So, for example, in the continental part of Croatia, most of the residents produce around 200 to 300 kilos of waste per inhabitant per year. On the other hand, in the Adriatic counties, you can see some very worrying numbers from 680 kilos per resident, 560 kilos per resident. It's not that they have some very different habits considering the waste, but it's tourism also here included. So that's the main impact when looking at the local level. And this is even worrying more, that municipality waste recovery rate by counties is better in the counties where we don't have tourism. So we have the opposite picture, which is unfortunately happening. So we have two different drivers that are definitely causing different responses. Fortunately, some of the Adriatic coastal counties, such as Primorsko-Goranska County, I will be talking about later, is having a better recovery rates and is using some of the modern possibilities to reduce the need for the landfills. And here we come to the example for the end, the example of the DPCR framework for the island of Krk. It's the island in the northern Adriatic. It's the biggest island in Croatia, where here we have recognized drivers through the different critical zones, transport and transit islands, littoralization, concentration of overall Croatian tourism demand through the pressures that are pushed through the drivers, which are some of the counted here, let's say land use for the waste management facilities, causing the state of the noise and light pollution, air, sea, bathing, water quality reduction, limited water supplies, and so on. And in the end, it is, of course, causing impacts through the threats on human health and well-being, wildlife biodiversity and forest, and, of course, on natural resources. In the end, some of the responses are stated here, which have been implemented. That's important. Out of the framework. Out of the indicators that are measured, the responses have been created through the cooperation between local authorities, economic instrument, but also waste management practices and awareness and behavior, which is one of the basics for quality waste management. When talking about Kirk, it's one of the 10 best European eco-islands, with a plan to become the first energy independent green Mediterranean island with zero CO2 emissions. So it's a good plan for them. Let's hope they manage it. But it's important to stress out that, of course, have a very high seasonality, which is fortunately getting a bit post and pre-season in the last few years before COVID are becoming bigger so the seasonality is getting a bit lower. But it's important to stress out also the quantities of the separately collected waste in tons in 2021, when we can see very clearly that through the seasonality, we have a great increase of the communal waste, of the also bio-waste, the food waste, which is produced in the hotels, also in the private accommodation and so on. So therefore, out of these actions, they have out of these numbers, they have concluded which are the ways they can manage these operations of the waste management. It's important to stress out that the total amount of waste collected in the island of Kirk in the last 3 years has been stagnating. However, there is a continuous increase in the share of waste generated by tourism activities. So that is something we must really put emphasis on. And some of the quantities are successfully collected and separately, which is obvious actually from this scheme. They wouldn't have these numbers if they didn't collect them separately. So this is one of the positive impacts of the waste management on this island. It's, for example, it's something not connected with tourism, but olive waste is separately collected when during the olive season. So it's in the autumn, we can see one peak here. So they have very precise system of the measurement of the diverse types of the waste. And through the DPCR framework, they have then created the answers. So it's important to point out that already during the start of the 2000s, a company Ponikve, which is managing the waste on the Krk, I would like to emphasize it's the company owned by the municipalities on the island of Krk. So it's not private, but it's still very efficient. And it's established on ecological waste management system on the entire island. They have, this is actually the first solution in Croatia, which had the aim to collect and recycle as much waste as possible. And they have implemented diverse projects. I'm not going to go in details, which we don't have time for, but in last 10 years, they've implemented door-to-door project where they have increased the informations. And I would like to stress out the most important thing that they have been able to achieve. In 2019, the share of separated waste exceeded more than 55%, which is for Croatia great. And it's important to stress out that it is almost meeting the needs of the EU goals for 2022, which is 60% of the waste which is separated. Therefore, they have really good practices. And finally, they have also projects concerning, here it's the names of some of them. Here I have put it one picture, it's from their webpage for this year. They collect all the bio-waste, and to the successful project, they put the possibility of donating compost to household. It's not something that is paid, but they actually reduce the payments for the users if they take the compost from them. So it's a very good example of the circular economy. They are also sharing pocket waste bins, eco workshops are oftenly introduced, and so on. But in the end, it's important to state out that all this wouldn't be possible for them with the permanent participation and continuous behavior and awareness of the business sector on the island Kirk, especially hotel sector, private accommodation, and camps. They have a lot of camps, and since they have a lot of camps, it's they are more open to sustainability and frameworks which will help them have a more sustainability operation. Thank you for your attention. I hope that I have been short as expected.